Welcome to Blurr, where the shadows of history speak and forgotten trials come back to life. Tonight, we step into one of the most chilling and mysterious courtrooms in American history, a quiet town, a brutal crime, and a woman whose name would echo through generations. In the summer of 1892, the peaceful streets of Fall River, Massachusetts were shaken by a crime so shocking that it stunned the entire nation. Andrew Borden and his wife, Abby, were found brutally murdered in their own home. Suspicion soon fell upon someone no one expected: Andrew's daughter, Lizzie Borden. Was she a cold-blooded killer hiding behind a calm face, or an innocent woman trapped in a storm of accusation and fear? The courtroom would soon decide. But the truth has remained debated for more than a century. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share with friends, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another chilling story from Blurr. Now, dim the lights, listen closely, and let the trial begin. Chapter 1. A House on 2nd Street. Fall River, Massachusetts, in the summer of 1892, was a prosperous mill town, its streets lined with the modest but respectable homes of working families and the rather grander houses of those who had done well from the textile industry that drove the city's fortunes. It was a place of church-going respectability, of social obligation, and of a certain domestic propriety that the inhabitants took seriously. Nothing, on the surface, suggested that it was about to become the setting for one of the most sensational and stubbornly unsolved murders in American criminal history. At 92 2nd Street, close to the center of town, stood a two-story wooden house that was, by any reasonable measure, too small and too plain for the family that occupied it. Andrew Jackson Borden was one of the wealthiest men in Fall River, a banker, a real estate investor, and a businessman of considerable means. By the standards of his wealth, he lived with a parsimony that his neighbors found remarkable and his daughters found suffocating. Andrew Borden had money, but spending it was not something that came naturally to him. The household at 92 2nd Street consisted of Andrew himself, his second wife Abby, his two daughters from his first marriage, Emma and Lizzie, and the Irish domestic servant Bridget Sullivan. Emma, the elder daughter, was 41 years old in the summer of 1892, quiet and somewhat withdrawn. Lizzie, the younger, was 32, unmarried, active in the church and in various civic organizations, and known in Fall River as a respectable and socially engaged young woman. Beneath this surface of respectability, however, the household was deeply unhappy. The two daughters had never accepted their stepmother with anything approaching warmth. Lizzie had long since stopped calling Abby by any maternal title, referring to her simply as Mrs. Borden. The tension between the generations was palpable, sustained by years of small grievances, financial disputes, and the particular misery of people who are bound together by circumstance but held apart by temperament and distrust. On the morning of August 4th, 1892, something happened in that house that would be talked about for more than 130 years. Andrew Borden and his wife Abby were murdered, struck repeatedly about the head with a sharp-edged instrument, almost certainly a hatchet. And in the house at the time, as far as anyone could determine, were only two people who might have done it. One of them was Bridget Sullivan, the other was Lizzie Borden. Chapter 2. The morning of the murders. The morning of August 4th began unremarkably. The summer heat had been oppressive for several days, and the Borden household had been suffering from a bout of gastric illness that some would later attribute to contaminated food and others, more darkly, to something deliberate. Andrew Borden rose early, as was his habit, and went about his morning business. Abby Borden began her morning chores. Bridget Sullivan, the servant, was assigned to wash the outside windows. Emma Borden was away from home, visiting friends in the nearby town of Fairhaven. Andrew left the house around 9 in the morning to attend to various business matters downtown. Lizzie came downstairs, apparently ate some breakfast, and was seen by Bridget in the kitchen. The morning passed in the ordinary way of a warm summer day, windows being washed, errands being run, the quiet rhythms of domestic life proceeding. Andrew Borden returned home shortly before 11 o'clock. Bridget let him in as the front door was locked with 3 separate locks, an unusual security arrangement that would later prompt considerable speculation. Andrew settled onto the sofa in the sitting room, apparently intending to rest. A short time later, At somewhere around 10 minutes past 11, Lizzie called to Bridget from the foot of the stairs. Her exact words have been reported in slightly varying forms, but the substance was clear. She told Bridget to come down, that someone had killed her father. Bridget came downstairs and found Andrew Borden on the sofa, dead. He had been struck at least 10 times about the head and face with a sharp instrument. His wounds were severe enough that identification was initially difficult. A neighbor, Adelaide Churchill, was summoned. A doctor arrived, and then, in response to a suggestion from one of the women present that someone should look for Mrs. Borden, Bridget and Mrs. Churchill went upstairs to the guest room. And there they found Abby Borden lying dead on the floor beside the bed, struck 18 or 19 times in a similar fashion. Later medical examination would establish that Abby had been killed somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes before Andrew, probably while he was still out of the house. This timing was significant. Whoever had killed Abby had waited in the house or had returned to it, and then killed Andrew when he came home. This spoke to premeditation, to planning, and to a knowledge of the household's daily rhythms. The police arrived. The questions began. Lizzie told them she had been in the barn at the back of the property when her father was killed, looking for some lead sinkers she needed for a fishing trip she was planning. She had heard nothing, seen nothing, and had no idea who might have committed the murders. She appeared, by the accounts of those who observed her, surprisingly calm. Chapter 3. The Finger of Suspicion. From the very beginning of the investigation, suspicion moved almost inevitably toward Lizzie Borden. The reasons accumulated quickly and compellingly, even if none of them, taken individually, amounted to proof. The first and most fundamental difficulty was the question of entry and exit. The house on 2nd Street was, as several witnesses confirmed, locked on the morning of the murders. The front door had multiple locks. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere. Whoever had committed the murders had either been let in or had been already inside. No stranger had been observed entering the house, and the neighborhood, though not intensely watched, was not the sort of place where a blood-soaked intruder could have walked away unnoticed. The second difficulty was the absence of blood. Murders of this kind, carried out with a hatchet against persons at close range, produced a considerable quantity of blood. Yet Lizzie Borden, when she was observed by neighbors, by the doctor, and by the police shortly after the killings, showed no blood on her person or clothing. This was either evidence of innocence, or evidence of a remarkably thorough cleanup in a very short time, or evidence that she had changed her clothing. The third and most immediately suspicious development concerned events on the day before the murders. On August 3rd, Lizzie Borden had visited a local pharmacy and attempted to purchase prussic acid, which is hydrochloric acid, a fast-acting poison. The druggist, Eli Bence, had declined to sell it to her without a prescription. She had given an explanation about needing it to clean a sealskin cape, but Bence had refused nonetheless. This attempt to acquire poison on the eve of the murders would become one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the entire case. The fourth suspicious circumstance arose a few days after the murders, when Lizzie was observed burning a dress in the kitchen stove. Her sister Emma was present. Lizzie explained that the dress had been stained with paint and was no longer wearable. The police had already been through the house by this point, and the dress burning, conducted in the open kitchen with a witness present, had a strange quality to it. It was either the action of an innocent woman doing something completely ordinary, or the destruction of evidence carried out with a brazenness that bordered on defiance. The fifth element was the disappearing note. Lizzie told investigators that on the morning of the murders, Abby had received a note from someone asking her to visit a sick friend, and that this was why Abby had gone upstairs and out of sight. No such note was ever found. No sick friend ever came forward. The note, if it existed, had vanished as completely as the author of the murders. On August 11th, 1 week after the murders, Lizzie Borden was arrested and charged with the murders of her father and stepmother. She was taken to the jail in Taunton, where she would remain until her trial the following year. Chapter 4. The Tensions Within. To understand the Borden case, it is essential to understand the domestic atmosphere at 92 2nd Street in the years and months before the murders. It was not a happy home, and the unhappiness had deep roots. Andrew Borden's first wife, Sarah, had died in 1863, leaving him with 2 young daughters. He had remarried in 1865, taking as his second wife Abby Durfee Gray, a woman several years his senior who was, by all accounts, kind, domestic, and thoroughly unglamorous. Emma and Lizzie, who had been 2 and 7 at the time of their mother's death, never took to Abby with anything approaching genuine affection. As the years passed and they grew into adults, the relationship cooled further into a kind of armed coexistence. The financial arrangements of the household were a persistent source of bitterness. Sometime before the murders, Andrew had transferred a property to Abby's half-sister, a gesture that Lizzie and Emma interpreted as evidence of Abby's malign influence over their father and her determination to divert the family's wealth toward her own relatives. The daughters protested vigorously, and Andrew, apparently seeking to restore some peace, transferred a rental property to Lizzie and Emma as well. But the resentment lingered. The living arrangements themselves were a kind of architecture of estrangement. In the Borden house, the interior doors between the parents' side and the daughter's side were habitually locked. The 2 generations of the family used separate staircases, ate at separate times when relationships were at their most strained, and maintained a distance within the same small house that told its own story about the nature of their domestic life. Together, Lizzie had also, in the weeks before the murders, expressed to several people a vague but distinct sense of unease. She told her friend Alice Russell that she felt as though something terrible was going to happen, that she was afraid, though she could not say exactly what she feared. This statement, delivered before the murders, would later be examined intensely. Was it the premonition of a frightened, innocent woman who sensed danger she could not identify? Or was it something else altogether? Andrew Borden himself was not an easy man to live with. His frugality was legendary and his control over the household finances was absolute. Lizzie and Emma were grown women, educated and socially active, living in a house without modern conveniences because their wealthy father saw no need for them. The frustration of that situation, sustained over decades, created a pressure that is not difficult to imagine. Chapter 5. The Inquest and Arrest. In the days following the murders, an inquest was convened before the local medical examiner, Judge Josiah Blaisdell. An inquest was a quasi-judicial proceeding, less formal than a full trial, intended to establish the facts of a suspicious death and determine whether there was sufficient cause to proceed further. Lizzie Borden was called to testify. Her testimony at the inquest was the most detailed account she ever gave of her whereabouts and activities on the morning of the murders. It was also, as her questioners noticed, marked by inconsistencies. Her account of where she had been, whether in the barn or in the loft above it, shifted slightly between different retellings. Her account of when she had last seen Abby alive, and of the note that was supposed to have called Abby away, was similarly uncertain. There were moments when she contradicted herself between questions asked only minutes apart. There was an important caveat, however, to this testimony. At the time of the inquest, Lizzie was being treated by her family physician with morphine and the sedative called sulfate of morphia, prescribed to manage the stress and distress she was experiencing following the murders. The defense would later argue with considerable force that testimony given under the influence of these substances could not be considered reliable and should not be used against her. This argument ultimately prevailed. When the case came to trial, the judges ruled that Lizzie's inquest testimony was inadmissible as evidence. This was a significant blow to the prosecution, which had hoped to use the inconsistencies in that testimony to undermine her credibility. A grand jury was convened in November 1892, heard the available evidence, and returned indictments against Lizzie Borden on 3 counts: the murder of Andrew Borden, the murder of Abby Borden, and a combined count charging both murders together. The trial was set for the following June in the Superior Court at New Bedford, Massachusetts. Chapter 6. The trial opens. The trial of Lizzie Borden opened on June 5, 1893, in New Bedford, before a panel of 3 judges: Chief Justice Albert Mason, Justice Caleb Blodgett, and Justice Justin Dewey. The unusual arrangement of 3 judges rather than one was not uncommon in Massachusetts capital cases of the period. The courtroom was packed from the first day, and the press coverage was intense. For the prosecution, the Commonwealth was represented by Attorney General Arthur Pillsbury and District Attorney Hosea Knowlton. Knowlton, in particular, had a difficult relationship with this case. He had serious private reservations about the strength of the evidence, and had initially been reluctant to pursue the prosecution as vigorously as some demanded. But he was a professional, and he presented the Commonwealth's case with skill and thoroughness. For the defense, Lizzie was represented by Andrew Jennings, her family's longtime attorney, and most prominently by former Governor George Robinson, one of the most celebrated advocates in Massachusetts. Robinson had served as governor from 1884 to 1887, and he brought to the courtroom not only formidable legal skills, but the personal authority and popular appeal of a man who had held the highest elected office in the state. His presence at the defense table was itself a statement. One significant aspect of the jury composition deserves note. In 1893, women were not eligible to serve as jurors in Massachusetts. The 12 men who sat in judgment on Lizzie Borden were all male, drawn from the farming and business communities of the region. They were men of their time and place, with all the assumptions about gender, class, and respectability that their time and place entailed. Knowlton opened for the prosecution with a comprehensive account of the Commonwealth's theory of the case. He argued that Lizzie Borden had motive, opportunity, and means. She had motive in her long-standing resentment of her stepmother and her fear that Abby's influence over Andrew would eventually deprive her and Emma of their inheritance. She had opportunity because she was in the house when both murders occurred, and she had means because the house contained a hatchet that the prosecution would argue was the murder weapon. Chapter 7. The evidence and its weaknesses. The central physical exhibit in the prosecution's case was a handleless hatchet found in the cellar of the Borden house during the police search. The handle had been broken off, and the metal head was covered in ash, which the prosecution suggested had been applied to conceal the removal of blood. This was the so-called handleless hatchet, and it became one of the most debated objects in American legal history. The problem was that no blood was found on the hatchet. There is no demonstrable connection between it and the wounds on either victim. Expert witnesses disagreed about whether it was consistent with the murder weapon. The prosecution had a hatchet but could not conclusively establish that it was the hatchet, and the defense exploited this uncertainty effectively. The absence of blood on Lizzie herself was the prosecution's most persistent problem. The medical examiners who testified described wounds that would have produced a very considerable amount of blood spatter. If Lizzie had stood close enough to her victims to deliver those blows, she should have been visibly bloody. Yet Bridget Sullivan, neighbors, and the first police officers on the scene all confirmed that they had seen no blood on Lizzie's clothing or person. The prosecution suggested she must have changed her clothes and destroyed the blood-stained garment. The burned dress became the focus of this argument. The attempt to purchase prussic acid was presented by the prosecution as evidence of premeditation. They argued that Lizzie had first planned to poison her victims, had been frustrated by the druggist's refusal, and had then resorted to the hatchet. This was a logical argument, but it required the jury to accept the druggist's testimony about an event that had no documentary record, and it required them to make an inferential leap from a failed attempt to buy one kind of poison to the commission of murder by an entirely different means. The judges dealt a serious blow to the prosecution early in the trial by ruling the inquest testimony inadmissible. This removed from the jury's consideration the most detailed and internally inconsistent account that Lizzie had given of her activities on the morning of the murders. Without it, the prosecution was left arguing from circumstance, from absence, and from inference, all of which are legitimate tools of advocacy, but none of which carries the weight of a direct statement by the defendant. The handling of the crime scene in the hours after the murders was also a source of weakness for the prosecution. The house had not been promptly secured. Neighbors, family, friends, and various well-wishers had come and gone through the rooms where the murders had been committed. The physical evidence had been disturbed before it was properly documented. By modern forensic standards, the investigation was deeply inadequate, and even by the standards of 1892, it left considerable room for criticism. Chapter 8. The witnesses. The trial called a long procession of witnesses, and their testimony built the case for both sides, brick by careful brick. Bridget Sullivan was among the most important witnesses the prosecution called. She had been in the house throughout the morning of the murders, and she had seen and heard more than anyone other than the killer. Her testimony was, for the prosecution, a double-edged sword. She confirmed that the house was locked and that no stranger had been admitted or observed. She confirmed the sequence of events that led to the discovery of the bodies. But she had not seen Lizzie do anything suspicious, and she had not seen anyone else in the house either. Her testimony established the circumstances without resolving the central question. The druggist Eli Bentz testified about Lizzie's attempt to purchase prussic acid. His account was straightforward. Lizzie had come in the day before the murders, had asked for the poison, had explained that she needed it to clean a sealskin cape, and had been refused. The defense would challenge both his identification of Lizzie and his recollection of the conversation, but his testimony stood as one of the prosecution's most damaging pieces of evidence. Medical witnesses testified in detail about the nature of the wounds and the timing of the deaths. The evidence that Abby had died considerably before Andrew was established through testimony about body temperature and the state of digestion. This timing, as the prosecution emphasized, meant that the killer had either remained in the house for a substantial period between the two murders or had left and returned, both of which seemed to require either considerable nerve or intimate familiarity with the household schedule. The defense called witnesses who claimed to have seen a suspicious stranger in the neighborhood around the time of the murders. One witness described a young man loitering near the house. Another reported hearing a man make threatening statements about Andrew Borden sometime before the murders. These witnesses were presented as evidence of an alternative suspect, an unknown assailant who had entered the house by some means, committed both murders, and escaped undetected. The prosecution attacked these witnesses on cross-examination, pointing out inconsistencies in their accounts and suggesting that their observations, even taken at face value, fell well short of establishing the existence of any specific perpetrator. Alice Russell, Lizzie's close friend, gave testimony that was painful for both sides. She had been present when Lizzie burned the dress in the kitchen stove, and she had heard Lizzie say, before the murders, that she was afraid something terrible was about to happen. Her account of the dress burning described Lizzie holding the garment up in full view of the kitchen window, while a police officer stood in the yard outside. This detail, which the defense emphasized, was difficult to square with the picture of a guilty woman destroying incriminating evidence in secret. Chapter 9. Robinson's defense. George Robinson's conduct of the defense was, by the standards of his time and by many later assessments, a masterpiece of advocacy. He combined technical legal skill with a profound understanding of the jury he was addressing and the cultural moment in which the trial was taking place. His central argument was simple, and he returned to it again and again throughout the trial. There was no direct evidence that Lizzie Borden had committed these murders. No witness had seen her do it. No murder weapon had been conclusively identified and linked to her. No blood had been found on her. Everything the prosecution offered was inference and circumstance, and inference and circumstance, however suggestive, could not sustain a verdict of guilty in a capital case beyond a reasonable doubt. Robinson also worked systematically to dismantle each of the prosecution's specific pieces of evidence. On the handleless hatchet, he emphasized the absence of blood and the absence of any proven connection to the wounds. On the burned dress, he presented Alice Russell's account of the burning, which made it seem more like an ordinary domestic act than a furtive destruction of evidence. On the prussic acid, he challenged Bentz's identification and the inferential chain from a failed poison purchase to a subsequent hatchet murder. But Robinson's most powerful weapon was not any specific legal argument. It was character. He presented Lizzie Borden to the jury as a woman of unimpeachable respectability, a churchgoer, a supporter of charitable causes, a daughter who had lived all her life in her father's house. He asked the jury, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, whether they could truly believe that such a woman was capable of the acts described, of standing over her stepmother and raining 18 or 19 blows upon her head, of waiting calmly in that house for more than an hour and then repeating the act upon her father when he came home. In his closing argument, Robinson spoke at length about the character of women of Lizzie's class and background. He invoked the Victorian and Edwardian ideal of womanhood, the notion that women of refinement and religious conviction were, by their very nature, incapable of this kind of brutal physical violence. He asked the jury to consider not just the evidence, but what they knew of human nature, and what they knew of human nature told them that Lizzie Borden could not have done this. It was, viewed from a modern perspective, an argument built partly on evidence and partly on gender prejudice. But it was an argument perfectly calibrated for its audience. 12 men who shared those cultural assumptions entirely, and who would have found it genuinely difficult to imagine a woman of Lizzie's standing committing such acts. Chapter 10. The Prosecution's Difficulties. Hosea Knowlton faced a formidable challenge. He had a case built largely on circumstance: an unidentified murder weapon, a missing note, a burned dress, and the simple but unprovable logic that Lizzie was there and no one else was. Against him, he had a defendant who presented well, a defense led by a former governor, and a jury primed by cultural assumptions to resist convicting a woman like Lizzie of a crime like this. Knowlton pressed every available argument with professional determination. He dwelt on the illogic of an unknown intruder theory. He asked the jury to consider how a stranger could have entered the locked house, killed Abby without being heard by anyone, concealed himself for more than an hour, and then killed Andrew and made his escape without leaving a trace or being seen by any of the several people in and around the house that morning. He returned repeatedly to the question of motive, arguing that the financial tensions within the Borden family, the resentment over the property transfers, and the long-standing hostility between Lizzie and Abby created a compelling explanation for why Lizzie might have decided to act. He argued that the timing of Abby's murder, in the gap when Andrew was out of the house, showed planning and intent. But when Knowlton came to the question of the blood, he struggled. He could suggest that Lizzie had worn something over her dress that she subsequently destroyed. He could point to the burned dress as the most likely candidate. But he could not show the jury the blood-stained garment. He could not produce a witness who had seen her in bloody clothing. He was asking the jury to infer the existence of evidence that had been destroyed, and while that inference was not unreasonable, it was not proven. The exclusion of the inquest testimony compounded his difficulties. The inconsistencies in Lizzie's account, which had seemed so significant when they were first recorded, were now off-limits. The jury would not hear the version of events in which Lizzie had contradicted herself about her location in the barn, or about when she had last seen Abby alive. Knowlton had to make his case without what he might have considered his most useful impeachment material. Chapter 11. The Judges and the Charge. The conduct of the three judges throughout the trial was notable for its apparent sympathy toward the defense. Several of the prosecution's evidentiary efforts were blocked. The inquest testimony was excluded. Certain questions about Lizzie's knowledge of the locks on the front door were disallowed. The overall tenor of the judicial rulings tilted, more often than not, in the direction of the defendant. Chief Justice Mason's charge to the jury was particularly striking. He summarized the evidence carefully and reminded the jurors of the applicable legal standards. But he also told them that they should bring to bear on their deliberations their knowledge of human nature, and that the hypothesis of Lizzie's guilt required them to believe things about her character and conduct that human nature, as he understood it, made very difficult to accept. This passage of the charge was, in effect, an instruction to the jury to draw on the same gender-based assumptions that Robinson had been invoking throughout the trial. Mason was telling the jury that a woman of Lizzie's background and character was not the sort of person who committed murders of this kind, and that if they found it hard to believe she had done so, that difficulty was itself a form of evidence. Legal historians writing about this case in later decades have been critical of the charge, and indeed of the general conduct of the trial by the bench. The argument has been made that the prosecution did not receive a fair hearing, that the exclusion of the inquest testimony was questionable as a matter of law, and that the charge to the jury crossed the line from legal instruction into advocacy on behalf of the defense. Whether those criticisms are fully justified is a matter on which thoughtful people still disagree. What is clear is that the judicial atmosphere at the trial was considerably more favorable to Lizzie Borden than to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Chapter 12. The Verdict. On June 20th, 1893, after 13 days of testimony and argument, the case was given to the jury. They retired at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The courtroom waited. The reporters filed their preliminary dispatches. The spectators, who had packed the public gallery throughout the trial, settled into the particular tense stillness of people who know they are about to witness something historically significant. At 4:04, the jury returned. They had been out for 1 hour and 5 minutes. In a murder trial of this complexity, with this much at stake, 1 hour was an extraordinarily brief deliberation. It spoke volumes about the state of the jury's collective mind. The foreman delivered the verdict on each of the 3 counts. Not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. The courtroom erupted. There was applause. There were cheers. There were tears. Lizzie Borden wept. Her sister Emma embraced her. George Robinson accepted congratulations with the gracious composure of a man who had expected this outcome. Outside the courthouse, the news spread quickly through the crowd that had gathered, and the reaction was largely one of relief and satisfaction. The newspapers, most of which had been covering the trial with an unmistakable sympathy for the defendant, hailed the verdict as the triumph of justice. Religious organizations and women's groups sent messages of congratulation. Fall River, which had been divided and unsettled by the entire affair, appeared ready to put the matter behind it, but the murders remained unsolved. Andrew and Abby Borden were dead, and no one had been held responsible for killing them. That fact sat at the center of the celebration like a stone. Chapter 13, Life After Acquittal. Lizzie Borden was free, but freedom, for her, turned out to be a complicated condition. She returned to Fall River, the city where everyone knew who she was and what she had been accused of. The acquittal had cleared her in law, but not in the minds of a substantial portion of her neighbors, who continued to regard her with suspicion, distaste, or the particular kind of cold social ostracism that can be more painful than open hostility. She used the substantial inheritance she received from her father's estate to move to the Hill, the fashionable district of Fall River that had always been beyond the reach of the Second Street house. She bought a large and handsome home, which she named Maplecroft, and furnished and maintained it in the style that her father's parsimony had always denied her. She had servants now, and a stable, and the comforts of a life lived as she had imagined it. She also began calling herself Lizbeth rather than Lizzie, a small but deliberate act of self-reinvention. The name Lizzie Borden had become, in the public imagination, something larger and darker than any individual person could comfortably inhabit. Lizbeth Andrew Borden was an attempt to be someone new, someone who had not stood in the dock at New Bedford and heard the word murder spoken in connection with her name. The social rehabilitation she sought proved largely unattainable. Old friends who had supported her publicly during the trial now found reasons to maintain their distance. Churches that had prayed for her acquittal did not welcome her back into their social circles with any great warmth. Fall River was a small city, and its memory was long. The relationship between Lizzie and Emma deteriorated in the years after the acquittal. Emma was uncomfortable with the direction her sister's life was taking, particularly Lizzie's friendship with a Boston actress named Nance O'Neill, which became a subject of considerable local gossip. In 1905, Emma moved out of Maplecroft, and the two sisters never lived together again. They are not believed to have spoken in the years before their deaths. Lizzie Borden died on June 1, 1927, at the age of 66. Her sister Emma died 9 days later. They were buried in the family plot at Oak Grove Cemetery in Fall River, beside their parents, the father and stepmother whose deaths had defined and consumed so much of their lives. Chapter 14. Was she guilty? The question that has occupied writers, historians, and criminologists for well over a century is the one that the jury's verdict left deliberately unresolved. Was Lizzie Borden guilty of murdering her father and stepmother? The legal answer is no. The historical answer is not so simple. The case for her guilt rests on a collection of circumstances that, taken together, is not easy to dismiss. She was one of only 2 people in the house when both murders occurred. The other, Bridget Sullivan, had no apparent motive and no known history of violence. The murders required a detailed knowledge of the household's routine, specifically the knowledge that Abby could be killed in the upstairs guest room while Andrew was out, and that Andrew would return within a predictable time frame. The attempt to buy poison the day before suggested prior planning. The burned dress suggested the destruction of evidence. The inconsistencies in her account of her movements that morning suggested, at the least, that her version of events was not entirely truthful. The case for her innocence is also serious. The complete absence of blood on her person, given the nature of the wounds, is a genuine difficulty for the prosecution's theory. The murders were extraordinarily violent, and the evidence suggests the killer stood very close to the victims while delivering the blows. A person who had done that would have been very difficult to clean up in the available time. The burned dress, whatever it was burned openly in full view of the kitchen window, not in secret, and no murder weapon was ever conclusively identified. Several alternative theories have been proposed over the years. One suggests that Emma Borden was somehow involved, perhaps having returned from Fairhaven without anyone's knowledge. Another proposes John Vinicum Morse, Andrew's brother-in-law, who had stayed at the house the night before the murders and was present in the neighborhood on the morning of August 4th. A third, more speculative theory involves an illegitimate son of Andrew's who might have had reasons of his own to bear a grievance. None of these theories has been substantiated by convincing evidence. The most that can be said honestly is that the evidence strongly suggests Lizzie Borden was responsible for the murders, but does not prove it beyond the doubt that the law requires. Whether that means she was innocent or merely that the case against her fell short of the necessary standard is a distinction that the law draws clearly but that history finds harder to honor. Chapter 15. The legal legacy. The Borden trial has a secure place in the history of American criminal law, and its significance goes beyond the particular facts of the case. It raised, in a vivid and widely publicized way, several questions that remain central to the administration of criminal justice. The exclusion of the inquest testimony was a landmark evidentiary ruling. The judge's decision rested on the principle that statements made by a person who is, in effect, a suspect, without the benefit of legal counsel and in a coercive quasi-judicial setting, should not be usable against them in a subsequent criminal trial. This principle is closely related to the protections embodied in the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution, which guarantees that no person shall be compelled to be a witness against themselves. The Borden ruling was an early application, in state court, of principles that would later be developed further and formalized in the federal constitutional jurisprudence of the 20th century. The case also stands as a powerful illustration of the limits of circumstantial evidence. The prosecution's case was, by most dispassionate assessments, quite strong as a matter of logic and inference. The circumstances pointed overwhelmingly in one direction, but the law requires something more than compelling inference in capital cases. It requires proof beyond reasonable doubt, and the prosecution was unable to provide it in a form that satisfied either the judges or the jury. The case also raised, though it did not resolve, the question of whether pre-trial publicity can deprive a defendant of a fair trial. The coverage of the Borden case was extensive, opinionated, and largely sympathetic to Lizzie. Whether this sympathy influenced the outcome is impossible to measure, but the question it raises has become increasingly important in subsequent decades as the reach and speed of mass media have grown. Chapter 16. Gender, Class, and Justice. One of the most important and enduring aspects of the Borden case is what it reveals about the intersection of gender, class, and the administration of justice in late 19th century America. Lizzie Borden benefited, in the most direct and material way, from the cultural assumptions of her time about women of her class and background. The Victorian ideal of womanhood held that women, particularly women of respectable middle and upper middle class families, were gentle, domestic, and inherently incapable of violent crime. This ideal was not merely a social norm. It was a belief about the essential nature of femininity, and it pervaded the courtroom in the Borden trial as thoroughly as any piece of evidence. Robinson's closing argument made this assumption explicit, and the Chief Justice's charge to the jury echoed it. Both were telling the all-male jury that the image of Lizzie Borden committing the acts described was simply inconsistent with what they knew about women like her. This was not a legal argument. It was a cultural argument, an appeal to shared prejudice dressed in the language of human nature. The class dimension was equally significant. Lizzie Borden was a woman of means, social standing, and religious respectability. She was known and regarded positively by people who mattered in Fall River. Her defense was funded by the family estate and led by a former governor of the state. The symbolic weight of all of this, the churches, the women's organizations, the community connections, created an atmosphere in which conviction would have felt like an assault on Fall River's sense of itself. Some feminist historians have approached the case from a different angle, arguing that if Lizzie was guilty, she was a woman who struck back against a patriarchal household that had constrained and diminished her for decades. From this perspective, the murders were not simply a crime, but a form of revolt, however terrible, against a domestic arrangement that denied her autonomy, dignity, and the material comfort that her father's wealth could easily have provided. This reading does not exculpate Lizzie Borden, but it situates her actions, if they were her actions, within a social structure that was itself deeply unjust. Chapter 17. Lizzie in popular culture. Few figures in American criminal history have embedded themselves in the popular imagination as deeply and as durably as Lizzie Borden. Within months of the trial, a children's skipping rhyme was circulating in schoolyards across New England, attaching her name to the murders in a form that was simultaneously playful and macabre, and that has never quite disappeared. The rhyme took liberties with the actual number of blows delivered, as popular memory often does, but it captured something about the case that the public found irresistible. The reasons for the case's cultural staying power are not difficult to identify. It has the elements of great crime literature: a domestic setting, a respectable family, hidden tensions, a brutal act, an unsatisfying resolution, and an unanswerable question at its center. It is the kind of story that invites endless retelling, because each retelling can find something new in it. Novels, plays, films, operas, and television programs have all drawn on the Borden story. Some have portrayed Lizzie as a cold-blooded killer who walked free on the strength of Victorian gender prejudice. Others have portrayed her as a genuinely innocent woman whose acquittal was the correct verdict on a weak case. Still others have imagined her as a more ambiguous figure, someone driven by long years of suffering to an act that she herself may not have fully understood. The house at 92 2nd Street still stands in Fall River. It has been converted into a bed and breakfast in a museum, and it draws thousands of visitors every year. Guests can sleep in the rooms where the Borden family slept, eat breakfast in the kitchen where Bridget Sullivan worked, and tour the sitting room where Andrew Borden died on his sofa on that August morning, more than 130 years ago. It is a peculiar form of commemoration, part historical preservation and part commercial theater. But it speaks to the enduring grip of a story that refuses to let go. To understand the Borden case fully, it helps to understand the world in which it occurred. The America of 1892 was in the middle of what Mark Twain memorably named the Gilded Age, a period of rapid industrial expansion and the accumulation of vast private fortunes, but also of deepening social inequality and a set of social conventions that were straining under the pressure of change. Fall River was a mill town, its prosperity built on textile manufacturing and the labor of immigrant workers. The Borden family occupied a distinctive position in this social landscape, wealthy enough to belong to the respectable middle class, but not wealthy enough, or not willing enough, to live in the style that wealth might have permitted. Andrew Borden was a man of the old New England way, tight with money, suspicious of ostentation, attached to habits formed in harder times. His daughters had grown up in a different world from the one their father had been formed by. They were educated women who read newspapers, participated in social organizations, and were aware of the debates about women's rights and women's roles that were becoming increasingly central to American public life in the 1880s and 1890s. They lived in a house that was, by any modern or even contemporary standard, inadequate for their needs and insulting to their dignity, and they had no legal or practical recourse to change their situation as long as their father remained alive and controlled the family money. This tension between the old domestic order and the aspirations of the new woman is one of the deep themes of the Borden case, whether or not Lizzie was guilty of anything. The house on 2nd Street was not just a home. It was an enclosure, a place where two adult women of intelligence and social ambition were kept in a kind of genteel captivity by a father who saw no reason to spend money on their comfort or to acknowledge the legitimate claims of their individual lives. Chapter 19. Unanswered Questions. More than a century of investigation, speculation, and scholarship has not resolved the central mystery of the Borden case. Modern criminologists and forensic specialists have revisited the evidence with the tools of contemporary analysis, and while their work has added nuance and detail, it has not produced a definitive answer. The question of blood spatter, for example, has been analyzed by modern experts who have argued about what the pattern and volume of blood at the crime scene can and cannot tell us about the position and movements of the killer. Some have argued that the evidence is consistent with a killer who avoided significant contamination, Others have argued that it is not. The tools of modern forensic science can refine the question, but they cannot answer it, because the physical evidence from the crime scene no longer exists in a form that would permit definitive analysis. The note that was supposed to have called Abby Borden out of the kitchen and upstairs to the guest room where she was killed has never been explained. If the note existed and was genuine, it would mean that a third party was involved in luring Abby to her death. If Lizzie invented the note, it raises the question of why she would introduce into her account an element that was so easily disproven. Neither explanation is entirely satisfying. The question of how the killer entered and left the house remains unresolved. The multiple locks on the front door, the arrangement of the other doors, and the presence of Bridget Sullivan in and around the house all morning make it difficult to construct a convincing scenario in which an unknown outsider committed both murders and escaped undetected. But it is not impossible, and the impossibility of proving a negative means that this alternative cannot be definitively ruled out. Perhaps the most that can honestly be said is this: the evidence, as it existed in 1893, and as it can be reconstructed today, pointed strongly toward Lizzie Borden. Whether it pointed strongly enough to meet the legal standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt was a question that the jury answered in the negative, and in doing so, they followed both the letter and a defensible interpretation of the spirit law. Whether their answer was the right one in terms of what actually happened on August 4, 1892, is a question that cannot be answered with the certainty the question deserves. Chapter 20. A story without an ending. On the morning of August 4, 1892, 2 people were murdered in a house on 2nd Street in Fall River, Massachusetts. The murders were brutal and premeditated. The killer was never identified, never tried, and never convicted. This is the most essential fact about the Borden case, and it is a fact that no amount of subsequent investigation, speculation, or cultural elaboration has been able to change. Lizzie Borden lived for 34 years after the murders. She spent those years in the city where the murders occurred, in a house a short distance from the house where her parents had died, known to everyone and genuinely known by almost no one. Whether she carried a secret through those years, or whether she carried only the weight of a false accusation, is something we cannot know. Her face in the photographs taken in her later years reveals nothing. She was a woman practiced in concealment. Whatever it was she was concealing. The trial of Lizzie Borden teaches us things that go beyond the facts of the case. It teaches us that the criminal justice system operates within the constraints of what can be proved, and that what can be proved and what is true are not always the same thing. It teaches us that the standards we set for conviction, however imperfect in their application, exist for good reasons, because the alternative, convicting people on suspicion and inference alone, is worse. It teaches us that who stands in the dock, and who sits in the jury box, and who presides from the bench, shapes the administration of justice in ways that are not always visible, but are always significant. And it teaches us something about the enduring human appetite for stories that resist resolution. We want to know what happened in that house. We want to assign responsibility and close the account, but the account will not close. The question remains open, as it has remained open for generations, and as it will most likely remain open for generations more. Andrew and Abby Borden lie in the family plot at Oak Grove Cemetery. Lizzie lies there too, a few feet away, in the same soil, under the same New England sky. If the dead could speak, the silence of that cemetery might finally be broken. But the dead do not speak, and the silence of Fall River has held for a very long time. This has been the story of Lizzie Borden, a woman acquitted of murder, a woman whose acquittal settled nothing, and a woman whose name, more than 130 years after the events that made it famous, is still spoken with the mixture of fascination, uncertainty, and unease that surrounds all great unsolved mysteries.